Have you ever had someone try to gaslight you into thinking your own property wasn't actually yours? I never thought I'd face that level of delusion until Margaret Phillips stormed into my life, waving papers and claiming she had legal rights to my backyard. Trust me, what happened next made me realize just how far some people will go to maintain their illusion of control. I just moved into Cedar Grove Estates 3 months ago, drawn in by its pristine lawns, quiet streets, and the promise of a fresh start after my divorce. The community seemed picture-perfect. Mature oak trees lining wide sidewalks, well-maintained homes, and neighbors who actually waved when you drove past. Even the HOA rules seemed reasonable. Keep your lawn tidy, no wild paint colors, basic stuff that any homeowner would follow anyway. My house, a 2-story colonial with a generous backyard, was perfect for what I had in mind. I'd always dreamed of building a workshop where I could pursue my passion for furniture making. The previous owner had left behind a solid concrete pad, the perfect foundation for my plans. After getting the architectural plans approved through proper channels, I was ready to begin construction. That's when I met Margaret Phillips, and my peaceful suburban dream turned into a nightmare. It was a crisp Saturday morning when I heard the sharp tap of heels on my driveway. I was marking out the workshop's footprint when a shadow fell across my measurements. "Excuse me, but what exactly do you think you're doing?" The voice was cold, clipped, and dripping with manufactured authority. I turned to find a woman in her 50s, immaculately dressed in a powder blue pantsuit, her silver-streaked hair cut in an expensive bob. She clutched a leather portfolio like it was a shield of authority. "Good morning," I said, straightening up. "I'm Alex Chun, the new owner. Just marking out my workshop space. All approved by the HOA board last week." Her perfectly plucked eyebrows arched. "I'm Margaret Phillips, HOA president, and I don't recall approving any such thing. This area is designated as a community access point." I blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "This is my private property. I have the deed and the approval documents right here." I gestured toward my folder of paperwork on the patio table. Margaret's lips tightened into a thin line. "Perhaps you're new to how things work here, Mr. Chun, but this pathway has been used by the community for decades. We require access for maintenance and inspections." "There must be some mistake," I said, pulling out my property survey. "The property line is clearly marked, and there's no easement or right-of-way recorded." That's when things got weird. Margaret stepped onto my survey marks, deliberately scuffing them with her heel. "I don't appreciate newcomers trying to disrupt our community's established procedures. This pathway stays open, or there will be consequences." "Are you threatening me?" I asked, incredulous. Her smile was arctic. "I'm informing you of our community standards. The board takes violations very seriously." Before I could respond, she was already turning away, but not before delivering her parting shot. "I'd hate to see you waste money on a structure that will need to be removed. We have ways of dealing with difficult residents." I stood there, survey in hand, watching her stride away. Something in her tone sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just about a pathway or a workshop. This was about power. And Margaret Phillips had just made it clear she intended to show me who held it in Cedar Grove Estates. What I didn't know then was that this was just the beginning. Margaret's ways of dealing with difficult residents would soon prove to be far more sinister than I could have imagined. And that pathway, it was about to become the centerpiece of a neighborhood battle that would expose years of corruption and abuse of power. But looking back, I'm almost grateful for Margaret's threats that morning, because sometimes it takes a bully to unite people against them, and Cedar Grove Estates was about to learn exactly what happens when you push the wrong person too far. I should have known Margaret wouldn't let our confrontation end with just threats. The next morning, I found a neon orange violation notice taped to my front door, citing unauthorized construction planning and obstruction of community access. The paper even had the audacity to demand I pay a $500 fine within 48 hours. I immediately documented everything with photos and drafted a detailed email to the HOA board, attaching my approved plans and property survey. Margaret's response came within minutes. A two-line dismissal stating that historical community access supersedes recent documentation. No explanation, no legal basis, just pure bureaucratic nonsense. But the violation notices were just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, strange things started happening. First, my property survey stakes mysteriously disappeared overnight. Then, I'd catch glimpses of Margaret walking past my house, phone in hand, photographing every angle of my property, not even trying to be subtle about it, just standing there in broad daylight, documenting God knows what. The situation took an unsettling turn when I started finding my trash cans moved from their usual spot to directly across my supposed community pathway. Each time, they'd be placed precisely where they would most obstruct any construction work I might attempt. After the third time, I installed a security camera. Sure enough, the footage showed Margaret and her husband relocating my bins at 5:30 a.m., all while wearing their matching morning jogging outfits. One evening, while I was reviewing the security footage, my doorbell rang. It was Sarah Martinez, my next-door neighbor, looking nervously over her shoulder. I saw what Margaret's been doing, she said in a hushed voice once I invited her in. You're not the first, you know. The Petersons who lived here before you, they wanted to build a greenhouse. Margaret drove them out within 6 months. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her coffee mug. 3 years ago, she did the same to the Thompsons across the street. They tried to put in a pool. Margaret claimed it violated some ancient water rights agreement. When they challenged her, their cars started getting mysterious scratches. Their kids' bikes disappeared. Nothing could ever be proven, of course. Why doesn't anyone stand up to her? I asked. Fear, Sarah replied simply. Margaret's husband is a retired judge. She's got connections at City Hall. Most people just give up and either fall in line or move away. The few who tried to fight. She shook her head. Let's just say Margaret knows how to make life difficult. As if to prove Sarah's point, the next day I received an email from the city's building department flagging potential permit violations in my workshop plans. The complaint had come from an anonymous source, but it wasn't hard to guess who. The final straw came when I returned home from work to find Margaret in my backyard with 2 other HOA board members, measuring tape in hand, acting as if she owned the place. When I confronted her, she smiled that predatory smile of hers. Just conducting our monthly property inspection, she said sweetly. As per Section 7.3 of the bylaws, I checked the bylaws that night. Section 7.3 didn't exist. That's when I knew this wasn't just about a pathway or a workshop anymore. This was about power, control, and years of unchecked authority. Margaret had spent years building her little kingdom of fear, using the HOA as her personal weapon. She expected me to fold like all the others. But Margaret had made a crucial mistake. Unlike the others, I had nothing left to lose. My divorce had taught me one valuable lesson. Sometimes you have to fight back, even when the odds seem stacked against you. And I had something the previous residents didn't: technology on my side. The next day, I ordered a comprehensive security system with motion sensors, high-definition cameras, and 24/7 cloud recording. I started documenting every interaction, every email, every violation notice. I began quietly talking to other neighbors, building a network of witnesses to Margaret's reign of terror. Margaret must have sensed something was different this time. Her tactics escalated. But what she didn't realize was that each new act of harassment, each attempted intimidation, was just adding to the mountain of evidence I was collecting. She thought she was dealing with just another pushover resident. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The question wasn't if she would fall, but how hard, and how many of her victims would step forward once they realized they weren't alone. The high-definition security footage played on my laptop screen with crystal clarity. There was Margaret, illuminated by my motion-activated lights, at 3 a.m., methodically spreading what looked like grass killer across my front lawn in precise lines. Her trademark blue pantsuit had been replaced by dark clothing, but that meticulously maintained silver bob was unmistakable. I couldn't help but smile. This was exactly what I'd been waiting for. Over the past month, I'd transformed my home into a surveillance fortress. 8 4K cameras covered every angle of my property, each equipped with night vision and motion sensors. Every entrance was monitored, every corner recorded. The system backed everything up to secure cloud storage, no chance of accidentally losing footage. But the cameras were just the beginning. I'd also installed a weather-sealed microphone system after noticing Margaret's habit of muttering threats under her breath during her inspections. Now I had crystal-clear audio to accompany the video evidence. The system had already captured her making some particularly interesting statements about how she handled previous residents. My garage had become my war room. One wall was covered with a timeline of events, each incident meticulously documented with photos, emails, and timestamps. Another section displayed a growing collection of false violation notices. I was up to 27 now, each more ridiculous than the last. My favorite cited me for excessive surveillance equipment installation. Apparently, protecting your own property was against Margaret's imaginary rules. The real breakthrough came when Tom Richards, a former HOA board member, reached out to me. We met at a coffee shop 2 towns over. He was worried about being seen talking to me. I resigned 3 years ago, Tom explained, hands wrapped tightly around his coffee cup. I couldn't stomach what Margaret was doing anymore, but I kept copies of everything. He slid a USB drive across the table. Financial records, meeting minutes, altered bylaws. She's been falsifying documents for years. The drive was a gold mine. Margaret had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom, creating fake rules on the fly and selectively enforcing real ones. She'd even been funneling HOA funds into a separate account for emergency maintenance that seemed to mainly involve landscaping work done exclusively by her brother's company. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Sarah Martinez, my next-door neighbor, had been keeping a detailed diary of Margaret's reign of terror. She had dates, times, and photographs going back 5 years. The day she handed it to me, her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. She made my daughter cry, Sarah said quietly. We wanted to put up a treehouse, fully within guidelines, professionally built. Margaret said it would lower property values. Then she started telling other parents not to let their kids play with Emily, a 10-year-old girl, isolated because her mother wouldn't bow to Margaret's demands. The stories kept coming. The Hendersons rejected solar panel insulation. The Williams families denied accessibility ramp for their elderly mother. The Patels repeatedly rejected holiday decorations. Each incident carefully documented. Each victim afraid to speak up alone, but willing to join a united front. I was building an airtight case, but Margaret must have sensed the walls closing in. That's when she made her fatal mistake. I woke up one morning to find my entire workshop foundation had been jackhammered overnight. The security footage was shocking. Margaret had actually hired people to destroy my property, all while she supervised from her SUV. The contractor she'd hired was easy to track down. He was horrified to learn he'd been fed a lie about the foundation being unauthorized and gladly provided a sworn statement about Margaret hiring him. Even better, he had text messages from her explicitly directing him to remove the illegal structure immediately by any means necessary. That evening, as I was reviewing the new evidence, my phone lit up with messages from multiple neighbors. Margaret was calling an emergency HOA meeting for the next evening. The subject, discussion of persistent rule violations and community safety concerns, potential legal action against non-compliant residents. I couldn't help but laugh. She was actually going to try to use the HOA to punish me for documenting her crimes. It was perfect. She was walking right into the trap I'd spent months setting. Every piece of evidence was organized, every victim ready to testify, every illegal action documented in irrefutable detail. Tomorrow night, Margaret Phillips would learn the true meaning of community standards, and I had front row seats to watch her kingdom crumble. The HOA meeting room was packed. I'd never seen such a turnout. Margaret sat at the head table, exuding her usual air of smug authority, flanked by her remaining loyal board members. She'd actually installed extra lighting behind her chair, casting her in what she probably thought was an authoritative glow. Instead, it made her look like a B-movie villain about to reveal her master plan. I arrived early, setting up my laptop and a small projector I'd borrowed from work. Margaret watched me with barely concealed disdain, probably assuming I was preparing some amateur presentation to defend against her accusations. She had no idea what was coming. "Our first order of business," Margaret began, her voice dripping with artificial concern, "is addressing a serious threat to our community's standards and safety." She fixed me with what she clearly thought was an intimidating stare. "Mr. Chin has repeatedly violated our bylaws, installed invasive surveillance equipment, and destroyed community property." That's when I stood up. "Actually, Margaret, I'd like to address the board first. I have evidence of multiple criminal acts that need immediate attention." "You're out of order," she snapped, but I could see the first flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "According to the actual bylaws, not the altered versions you've been circulating, any resident can present evidence of misconduct at community meetings." I smiled, clicking my first slide into view. "Shall we begin with the footage of you vandalizing my property at 3 a.m.? Or would you prefer we start with the financial records, showing you embezzling HOA funds?" The room erupted in murmurs. Margaret's face went from flushed to pale in record time. "This is absurd," she sputtered. "I don't know what he's talking about. Let me refresh your memory. I played the crystal-clear footage of her spreading grass killer on my lawn, then the clip of her directing the contractor to destroy my foundation. The audio was perfect. You could hear every word of her instructions to make it look like an accident, but I wasn't done. I have sworn statements from 17 residents documenting years of harassment and abuse of power." I gestured to Tom Richards, who stood up, including testimony from former board members about falsified documents and misappropriated funds. Sarah Martinez stood next, clutching her diary. "We all have stories, Margaret. We're not afraid anymore." Margaret tried to maintain control, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "This is all lies. I've done nothing but protect this community's values." That's when I played my ace. The police and district attorney's office disagree. I nodded to the back of the room, where 2 detectives had quietly entered. They've been building their own case for weeks. "Everything I'm presenting here has already been submitted as evidence." The detective stepped forward, badge in hand. "Margaret Phillips, we need you to come with us. We have warrants for criminal harassment, vandalism, and embezzlement." The look on Margaret's face was priceless, a mix of disbelief, rage, and dawning horror as she realized her kingdom had crumbled. She tried to bolt for the door, but only made it 3 steps before the officers caught up with her. As they led her away, she turned to make one final threat. "You'll all regret this. I made this community what it is." "No, Margaret," I replied calmly. "You just showed us what we never wanted to be again." The aftermath was swift. The remaining board members resigned in shame. A complete audit revealed years of financial misconduct. My workshop was rebuilt, properly this time, with the HOA covering all costs. The community pathway through my yard turned out it had never existed except in Margaret's imagination. 6 months later, Cedar Grove Estates is a different place. We have a new board, elected transparently, with term limits and clear oversight. The oppressive rules Margaret had invented have been struck down. Kids play freely in their yards, holiday decorations go up without fear, and neighbors actually talk to each other instead of living in fear of the next violation notice. Sarah's daughter finally got her treehouse. The Patels host amazing Diwali celebrations that the whole community attends. The Williams family installed their accessibility ramp, and we organized a neighborhood effort to help rebuild their garden. Sometimes, when I'm working in my new workshop, I think about Margaret. Last I heard, she took a plea deal, house arrest and restitution payments. She moved away, of course. Rumor has it she's living in a condo now, one with no HOA. The security cameras? I kept them up, not out of fear anymore, but as a reminder. They watch over a community that finally feels like home, where the only standards that matter are kindness, respect, and being good neighbors to each other. After all, that's what community really means.